Well, hey everybody, welcome back to class. And this is the mini lecture video for module number 1, Psychoanalytic Theory's Core Concepts. I hope that you had a good first week in class and that you are navigating everything all right, finding everything that you need. And I wanted to just kind of welcome you to our first kind of official module where we're going to kind of get down to business with this module, looking at these different counseling theories that are important for all of us as human service students and professionals to be familiar with. Real quickly, just some housekeeping items. Again, with every one of these modules, there is going to be a little mini lecture video like this one. There's going to be a number of web pages of some lecture notes that I have provided for you with a lot of information. And this little video really is just intended to kind of summarize a lot of what is in those lecture notes. You've also got some textbook reading I've assigned to you that's in the module, and you've also got a discussion question and a homework assignment. And that's the way every single one of these modules will kind of look. Is you've got a little video to watch, you've got some notes to read through and review, you've got some stuff out of the textbook, a discussion question to share some ideas from your own experiences, your own opinions, and then a little written homework assignment. And the discussion question and the homework assignment, again, as a reminder, are normally due on Monday at 12 o'clock p.m. noon. So remember, our magic time in my classes is 12 o'clock noon. For this first module, because we are backing up to the Labor Day weekend next weekend, you actually have until Tuesday at noon, that would be on September the 8th, to do your discussion question and your homework assignment. So I've given you an extra day because the Labor Day weekend, but normally it will be on Monday when all of your information is needed. And so what we do in this class is we have 7 different counseling theories that we're going to look at this semester. The way we've broken those down, the way I've broken those down is we spend 2 weeks on every module, on every theory. So this first theory is called Psychoanalytic Theory. So we have Module 1 and Module 2 devoted to this theory. Module 3 and 4 will be the next theory. 5 and 6 will be the next theory. 7 theories total. And the way that we have them divided up is this. The first week of any theory is the core concepts. We're going to review just some core ideas that make this theory unique as far as what does it believe or teach us about people, human nature, their problems, change, all that kind of stuff. And then the second week is always the application. So concepts and then application. And so this week, psychoanalytic theory, we're going to look at some core concepts. Next week in Module 2, we're going to talk about some ways that as helpers, we put the ideas of psychoanalytic theory to work, so to speak. You can't put something to work until you understand it first. So this first module, module number 1, is really the basic core concepts, and before we look then at the application. So that's kind of the way we'll do it with these 7 different theories. Gestalt theory, behavior theory, person-centered theory, existential, reality, cognitive behavior, and psychoanalytic, I think, are the 7 theories that we talk about. And there are many other approaches that are also available. Your textbook, for example, lists in detail several other different theories that we just don't have time to cover every single one. So we kind of center around these 7. A counseling theory is a helping approach. That's what counseling theories are. They are guidelines and helping approaches. And you looked at some of that last week in your opening week module. The idea that these are all of these different approaches that we're going to look at this semester. There's 7 of them. These are simply helping approaches that people previous to us have tested and found to be effective in working with people in counseling, social work, social service settings, helping people overcome and address their problems. And so that's what all these different theories are. There are a number of different ways in which we can and we do work with people. And it's just good to have a good understanding of these different theories. And the first theory we always cover in any counseling theories class. This was the way it was when I was in graduate school. It's the way I teach my class. We always start with the oldest one. The oldest one is Sigmund Freud's psychoanalytic theory, sometimes called psychodynamic theory. Psychoanalytic theory is always the first theory we start with because it was the first one developed. A little bit of background, a little bit of history. I know that you have heard of Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud we talk about Freud in psychology classes, sociology classes, English classes, social service classes. Freud is a controversial figure. He had a lot of issues in his own personal life. If you ever do any study on Freud, like many People who make great advances in psychology and science. Many of them had their own issues that they had to deal with and overcome. And Freud certainly falls in that category. Freud was alive and practicing about 100 years ago, the 1930s, the 1940s, so 75 to 100 years ago. Over in Europe, Freud was a psychiatrist in the early days of psychiatry. And Freud is credited with many, many things. One of the main things Freud is credited with was Freud was one of the first theorists. He was very well known and a very just very very famous kind of in his circle of influence. And Freud was famous for basically developing this idea of what we call assessment and diagnosis of psychological, emotional, behavioral problems, which we do today. In Freud's day, they were just beginning to label and diagnose medical problems. So they had names like cancer and diabetes and influenza, and they actually had names they had developed through medical research that they had begun to identify medical problems and how to assess and diagnose medical problems. Well, Freud was not interested in medical problems. He was interested in mental health and psychological problems. He was a psychiatrist. And he was one of the first ones who proposed the idea of, hey, just like we diagnose cancer, we can diagnose depression the same way. We can evaluate people's symptoms and we can evaluate how they're doing. And we can say, hey, this is a condition you struggle with that has a name. And giving it a name is helpful because it helps us to understand how to treat and help people with it, right? So Freud was identified as sort of seen as kind of the father of assessment and diagnosis. He's also too seen as the father of modern counseling, because Freud was also too the very first person to put together what we would call today a counseling approach. Prior to that, it was very random as far as how therapists and psychologists and psychiatrists worked with clients. Freud had an idea of putting together an organized, structured, clear theory that he proposed to people around him, and he proposed and used as he worked with his clients to help them understand and to help him understand why people were struggling. Person's having a problem in relationships. Well, why is that? Person battles depression. Well, why is that? Person has a hard time holding and keeping a job. Well, why is that? Person has all this anxiety and fear and worry about the world. Well, why is that? He began to put forth some interesting ideas about why people may struggle, with the idea of understanding why people struggle helps us then to help them. So this thing we call psychoanalytic theory is what he developed. He developed it about 100 years ago. And all of the other theories that we study in psychology and in counseling, in many ways, are built on Freud's theory in many, many, many ways. In some ways, Freud's ideas that he initially developed, we don't follow anymore because, again, these were just initial ideas that Freud had. Freud did not have access to MRIs and CAT scans and all the blood tests that we have today. He was doing the best with what he had, which was not much as far as technological advances. So some of the ideas that Freud had, we don't really follow and use anymore, but that's not a big deal. But there are a lot of ideas today that still in modern counseling in the 21st century, we still follow and we sort of apply oftentimes when we're working with people and their problems. And I want to highlight those. Again, there's so much more we could say about Freud, but I want to highlight for you 2 or 3 or 4 key ideas that he proposed almost 100 years ago that today we still draw from. So let's start with the first one. Number 1, this theory, Freud's theory, teaches that as men and women, we are complicated, that human beings by nature are complex and complicated. Mysterious is a good word I always think about when I think about Freud. Freud thought that understanding my mind, your mind is often complex and complicated, and that sometimes human behavior is mysterious, hard to understand. And Freud believed that for a couple of reasons, and we'll talk about that here in just a second. Freud believed that he used the analogy of peeling an onion. So if you've ever peeled an onion, onions have lots of really thin layers, and you peel a layer and then there's more stuff there, and you keep peeling, you keep peeling, you keep peeling. Well, Freud believed that getting to the bottom of a person's problem is like peeling an onion. You peel back one layer and there's more stuff there. You peel back another layer, there's more stuff there. You just keep going, you just keep going, you just keep going. So Freud had an interesting idea. He proposed that as people, men and women by nature, our emotions, our thoughts, our feelings, our behavior is complicated and it's complex. The human mind is And the human psyche is a phrase you may have heard the term psyche before, is a phrase that a term that we often attribute to Freud. Freud just believed that we were complex and complicated beings as men and women, complicated and mysterious. So that's a key idea, because there are other theories that came along after Freud, which we're going to cover a couple of those later this semester, and they kind of propose a little bit of a different idea, and that is that human behavior is not always mysterious and complicated. Freud believed, though, that it was, that understanding somebody and their problems and their issues is a deep-seated process, and understanding why we struggle. There's oftentimes no easy answer. So Freud saw people as being complex and complicated. Starts there. You can't understand Freud and psychoanalytic theory unless you understand at its base. This theory teaches that human nature is complex and complicated. Freud believed that at our nature, we are somewhat animalistic, that we are driven by pleasure. We are driven by survival. Freud believed that most of us by nature are selfish and self-centered. We want what we want. We want what feels good. There's something within us to where we want what we want. Freud believed that we have a strong survival instinct, and that we'll find a way to get through something, even if we have to find, even if the way that we find is not healthy. So Freud believed that a lot of behavior was coping behavior, a way for us to survive. Why do men and women abuse alcohol sometimes? Freud would say, well, they're just trying to cope. They're trying to survive. All of us are going to try to survive. And sometimes if we don't know what to do to survive, we're just not going to quit and give up. We're going to try to find a way to get through things. So this strong survival instinct. Freud believed that at our core, we are sexual beings. Freud believed that all of us as men and women, even in childhood, that we have strong sexual urges and strong sexuality that oftentimes drives us in healthy ways and sometimes not so healthy ways. So that's a little bit about what Freud kind of believed about just our base kind of human nature. Freud was also very interested in kind of a second idea, is this idea of a unique personality structure. So let's talk about personality for a second. Freud was really interested in psychoanalytic theory, is really interested in this thing called personality. Personality is that unique you, that unique. My personality is the part of me. It's my way of acting. It's my way of thinking. It's my way of looking at the world that is unique to me. And you have your own unique personality as well too. We sometimes use words like outgoing or introverted or social or private or laid back or perfectionistic or whatever to refer to our personality temperament. And Freud was really fascinated by how do we become who we are? It's a great question. So if I were to ask you today to describe for me in a few sentences your own unique personality, you might say, well, I'm kind of easygoing, I'm kind of sociable, I'm also kind of private, I'm kind of curious. You might start describing yourself and your personality. I could do the same thing. Imagine after you got done with that, I said, how did you become that way? Okay, now I hear you telling me who you are and how you are. How did you get like that? Were you born like that? Did someone teach you how to be like that? Are you naturally that way? Because all of us have different personalities. So how is it that we became who we are? So Freud believed that our personality structure, number one, is developed early in our lives through our early childhood experiences. This theory puts a big emphasis on childhood, good and bad, right? Freud would say, you want to know why Glenn is the way he is? Childhood. If I were to ask Freud, Dr. Freud, why is fill in your name? Why is Jennifer? Why is Blake the way they are, personality wise? He would say one word, childhood. This theory proposes that our unique personality structure was developed in childhood, and it was developed and shaped through our experiences, good, neutral, and not so good. The way our parents treated us, the family that we grew up in, the messages that we received, the kind of structure and nurturing, the kind of discipline that we had, the kind of role models that we had. Freud believed that our unique personality is developed in childhood. So that's a key idea with psychoanalytic theory. really puts a big emphasis on childhood development, childhood experiences. Okay. And then also, too, here's this idea, not just the idea of our personality developing in childhood. Freud had a unique idea about the parts of our personality. And so I want to review these three with you just really, really quickly. Freud believed, and maybe you've heard this if you've already taken your psychology class. Freud believed that our personality develops in three phases: one, two, three. So let's talk about the one, the two, the three. Number one, Freud believed that when you and I are born, we are already born with a personality temperament intact. All of us come with a personality pre-wired into us when we're born. That personality temperament naturally is very self-centered. It's naturally very what we call egocentric. When you and I were small and little, we wanted what we wanted, right? Someone had to teach you and me how to share our toys. For example, I have two adult children. And when my kids were little, I had to teach them how to share. I had to teach them how to say please and thank you. They did not come wired knowing how to do that. That wasn't a part of their nature. What they came wired with was, hey, give me that. That was just their nature, right? And they're good kids. They would cry in the middle of the night, wake me up. They didn't care if I was asleep. They wanted something to eat. They were bored. Their diaper was wet. They didn't care that they were inconveniencing me. They just wanted to be taken care of right then. So Freud believed this theory teaches that all of us are born kind of selfish and self-centered. And Freud gave an interesting name to that part of our personality. He called it the id. ID is how it's spelled. So all of us are born, and all of us have within our personality. Freud would say that every single one of us has an id part of our personality. All of us have a selfish, self-centered part of us. It's all there. You may cover it up, you may gloss it up, but Freud would say every single one of us has within us somewhere a selfish, self-centered nature. It's the oldest part of us, he would say. The first part of our personality that we are born with is the id. And then this theory teaches that through about the first 6 years of life, you and I begin to learn rules and rights and wrongs, and we learn how to share. Hopefully, someone's teaching us, like our parents or our teachers. They're teaching us, rules and yes, ma'am, and no, ma'am, and we're sort of learning how life kind of works. And we start developing what we call a moral compass. This idea that, hey, there's right and there's wrong. And the world is not just all about me, there's other people in the world. And Freud believed that as we begin to go through that process in our lives, another part of us called the superego begins to develop. Maybe you've heard the word ego before. This is similar to that. The superego develops second. So the id does not go away. The superego just kind of comes along and just kind of joins, if I can sort of do it that way, right? So there's that part of us that is perfectionistic. There's that part of us that wants to get everything right. You probably have a part of your personality where you don't want people making fun of you. You want people to love you and like you. That's not your id. Freud would say that is your superego. I'm that way. I mean, I don't want to make a fool of myself in front of people. I love it when people compliment me and give me praise because that feels good. Freud would say, yeah, that's that's the superego part of your personality. All of us want to be loved. All of us want to fit in. We kind of want what we want. The id sometimes is called like the wild animal, right? The wild man. We want what we want. The superego is kind of the opposite of that. And so this theory sort of teaches that within all of us, we have these two competing natural parts of us: the id, selfish and self-centered; the superego, got to get everything right, don't want to let anybody down, don't want to. And so we have these two competing kind of parts of our personality. The superego develops second. And then this theory, Freud kind of had this idea that, between the ages of like 6 and 10 years, we learn as we mature how to balance those two competing parts of our personality out. And a third part of our personality develops called the ego. Id, superego, ego. That's the order. Id present at birth, selfish and self-centered. Superego develops next. It's kind of the opposite of the id. It's that part of us that's always interested in getting everything right and perfectionism. And if we're going to be healthy people, we have to balance those two competing parts of our personality out, right? And so the ego is what develops third. So Freud believed that all of us hopefully have a part of our personality that helps us to balance those two competing parts out and helps us to kind of make sense of how to sort of do that, called the ego. So the ego is that part of your personality where you might, for example, work really hard during the week. You're real responsible. That's your superego. But then on the weekend, you might turn your phone off every once in a while and say, you know what, I'm going to do whatever I want to this week because I've had a hard, long week. That's your id, right? And so the ego is that part of us that kind of balances those two things out. Key idea. Freud, this theory teaches that healthy people have a strong ego. That sounds unusual because sometimes we think about the term ego in our culture and we say someone who has like a strong or a big ego, that's kind of like someone's like self-centered and kind of, narcissistic. That's not really where that idea comes from. Freud believed, this theory teaches that if you and I are to be healthy people, we have a strong ego because that means we live in balance. We're not too irresponsible. We're not too over responsible. And in life, right? It's so easy for us in life to be on two extremes. Some of us are super responsible, super rigid, super controlling, don't know how to have fun. Freud would say we have an overdeveloped superego. Other times, though, we're immature. Maybe you know someone who's overly immature, having fun all the time, can't bear responsibility, doesn't go to work, always, kind of an adult, but kind of a big kid. Well, Freud would say that person has an overdeveloped id. Healthy people live in balance. They have a strong ego, and that ego is the part of our personality that balances the two competing parts out. So id, superego, ego. Those are the three components of our personality structure, and they develop in that order: id first, superego second, and then the ego. So that's kind of an example. That's just one example of many of what I mean when I say Freud believed that our personality is complicated. Lots of different little layers. It's not real simple, right? Lots of different little layers, but it's not that difficult to understand. So I'm gonna wrap up this part of our video here. This is part one of our video. I want you to go back and review this video if you need to. We'll talk a little bit about complicated and mysterious and personality structure in childhood, id, ego, superego. I want you to come back and look at part two of the video. And we want to talk about the unconscious mind and defense mechanisms. Really, two other really important ideas related to this theory. But that'll be part two. So come back and watch part two in just a second. All right. See you then.